For 50 years, the Port of Moses Lake has been an integral part of southern Grant County and the city of Moses Lake. It has helped spur economic growth in the county, brought some of the world's most interesting aircraft to the skies above the city, and turned a possible economic disaster for the community into a thriving, bustling facility that regularly adds jobs to the local economy. The Port of Moses Lake celebrated 50 years of operations at the Grant County International Airport on July 1, 2016. It took hard work and a vision to make the Port of Moses Lake a reality after Larson Air Force Base was closed in 1966. By then, the Port of Moses Lake had been established by a vote of the residents, and the federal government had turned over most of the airport facility, valued at the time at $25 million, to the port. That's $186 million in today's dollars. The port had 3 strong commissioners in Leon Bodie, Floyd Rigsby, and Dan Dunn, and Colonel Clyde Owen had retired from the Air Force in order to become the first executive manager at the port. When it came time for the Air Force to leave, there were no issues with turning over the control tower to civilian control.
It was a common deal in closing these bases that if you wanted to keep the tower open, the new organization would have to hire the people and do it. And I had a file of applicants of people who had applied to work in our tower when the port took over. In this particular case, because of the Boeing operation and large airplanes flying, we needed a control facility. There was no trouble telling FAA to keep the base going. Magnuson took care of that. They took one small piece of equipment out of the tower. The Air Force did. That they claimed they needed in Vietnam. And the tower never did shut down. On the 1st of July, the Air Force walked down out of the tower, and the 5 civilian air traffic people assigned here took over. The equipment was never turned off. No equipment was ever shut down.
On July 1, 1966, the airport facilities were officially renamed Grant County Airport when it became part of the Port of Moses Lake. A public dedication ceremony of the new name was held on Saturday, October 8th of that year. The date was chosen because Washington Senator Warren Magnuson was available to be the keynote speaker. The commissioner set out an ambitious all-day ceremony. Planned events included a fly-in breakfast for private pilots from all over the Northwest, a luncheon at 1:30, and a skydiving exhibition by the Moses Lake Skydivers Club, featuring free-falling with trailing colored smoke. A stunt flyer named Dave Rahm was scheduled to entertain the crowd. Visitors would be able to tour the airport facilities, including the tower, and there were to be displays of aircraft ranging from home-built airplanes to antiques, and also jetliners. More than 100 officials were expected to attend, including Governor Dan Evans and representatives of the Department of Defense, the Air Force, the Departments of Health, Education, and Welfare, the General Services Administration, and of course, the Boeing Company. Several federal, state, and local elected officials were scheduled to be present. The ceremonies would culminate with a dedication at 3:00 p.m. in front of the control tower, when Senator Magnuson would give the keynote address. October 8th started out a cloudy, chilly, and windy day in the Columbia Basin. The fly-in only attracted a few pilots, not the hundreds expected. The first stunt flying show had to be canceled due to high winds. Still, 3,500 enthusiastic people attended from a town of just over 11,000 residents. The winds died down in the afternoon, and the skydivers were able to jump, and the stunt flyer gave a show at 2:00 p.m. West Coast Airlines took lucky visitors for rides in a Fairchild F-27 prop jet. There was a competition to bomb a target from private planes with flour bags. The winner got within 9 feet of the goal. In the afternoon, the dignitaries gathered at an outdoor stage. The 3 port commissioners spoke. Floyd Rigsby, chairman of the commission, said, "In the transformation of Larson Air Force Base to a civilian airport, we have had our days of despair, when things looked so black it seemed an impossible task." Senator Magnuson referred to the closing of the base as a disaster, but said that this ceremony dedicating the Grant County Airport represents a major milestone in the development of Central Washington. He went on to praise the work of the local people, saying, "The ingenuity and persistence displayed by the people of Grant County set an example which all communities might exemplify." After the fun and excitement of that day, after the dignitaries left and the crowds went home, hard reality set in for the port and its commissioners and executive manager Clyde Owen. There had yet to be any tax money coming in, as it was always a year late. Boeing had signed a contract to test flights and train crews at the airport. The company pledged $300,000 to fund port operations the first year until tax revenue started rolling in.
We just how you start something from scratch, and with no money. Of course, we had no money coming in for the port, and so Boeing guaranteed us $300,000 for the first year to operate the port. We spent $130,000 of it.
That $300,000 is more than $2.2 million in today's dollars that Boeing gave as a pledge to the port. It was obvious that Boeing didn't want anything to happen to that long runway so close to their factories in the Seattle area. They had already been using it before the port took over the airport.
Nobody wanted to let anything happen to that airfield, that runway. And it was very evident that Boeing needed it. I had let Boeing start using the airbase the minute that the fleet left, the airplane left in February, under a Air Force type arrangement. How we charged and all was a different deal. But the minute that last B-52 had wheels up, I told Boeing you could start using the base.
The port owned this facility worth $25 million, but it was in need of repair because the Air Force had neglected it. The port had no income other than what Boeing had pledged. The good news was that Boeing's business was booming, and they were using the airport more than expected.
Boeing at that time was training a whole lot of people, airlines, who had purchased the 707 airplane and needed the training. Now that was our main deal going there. Everything, and Boeing did all of the reporting of landings. They kept track of all that and just used. And then we went through the final phase of the testing of the Stretch 27. Then we went through the complete testing of the 737. And then in '69, we started the total testing of the B-47, the big testing. Wow. And then later on came the 57 and 67.
When Boeing first sold a 707, for example, to a domestic airline, the airline's instructors would come to Moses Lake to learn about the aircraft. Those instructors would then train the airline's pilots. When a foreign airline bought an airplane for the first time, they didn't send instructors, but sent the flight crews themselves to be trained. That meant more landings and more landing fees for the port. In October 1967, Boeing estimated landings at Grant County Airport at 19,500 in a year. That's more than 53 a day. In the first 4 months of 1968, the airport counted 54,537 takeoffs and landings, or about 453 per day. Airlines that sent pilots to Moses Lake included China Airlines, Portuguese Airways, New Zealand National Airways, United Arab Air, and many more. More than 300 foreign airlines would eventually train pilots at Grant County Airport, and Boeing paid the bills. The landing fees in 1968 generated $372,000 in revenue, where, by comparison, the tax revenue that year was only $46,000. The port needed more clients and more revenue. If it weren't for a conversation in Seattle, the port's biggest customer, Japan Airlines, or JAL, may not have ever come to Moses Lake.
Japan Airlines had a large delegation of people over in Seattle, and I'm sure they were likely talking about the negotiations of buying the 747. It was just coming at it. I don't know for sure. Anyhow, at one of the breaks of the meeting, one of the operational people of the Japan Airline went up to Tom Lane, who was the chief pilot and head of the flight program for Boeing, at a water cooler or someplace off to the side, and just mentioned to Tom, he said, by the way, and he used the word, by the way, do you know where we might do some training in the United States. And that's how it all started.
That was October of 1967. Boeing officials advised Owen that Japan Airlines might be interested in training in Moses Lake. Owen immediately put together an information package for the airline. For months, he didn't hear anything back. Then, in March of 1968, the airline asked for more information. In summer of '68, they sent a team to survey the facilities.
We got notification some way that a representative of Japan Airlines was coming to Moses Lake to check Grant County Airport. And a man by the name of Murakami was the first one to come. And after he got here, it was nothing but a steady stream of people from JAL all the rest of the summer reviewing Grant County Airport. They studied everything, and can't imagine what they did with a camera. They took pictures of everything. And so this was all during the summer of '68 when we were doing this. They made their first contact in October '67, and it was '68. Okay, we got down to the point they had about made up their mind. Yes, this is a location we want to come to. We had two major problems occur up. First, one of the requirements was they needed a commitment from a local motel to reserve for the capability of getting at least 50 rooms.
Japan Airlines was formed in 1951, and in 1953 became the national airline of Japan. By 1965, over half of Japan Airlines' revenue was generated on trans-Pacific routes to the United States. They needed long-range jet airliners to service these routes, such as the wide-body Boeing 747 that was in development at that time. Like the U.S. Army Air Corps back during World War II, Japan Airlines was attracted to Moses Lake by its wide-open spaces, clear airspace, and good weather. With the Boeing 747 coming, Japan Airlines needed a facility to train its pilots, and it had outgrown its test facility in Japan. It first tried Hilo, Hawaii, but ran into local opposition. Now Grant County Airport with that long runway seemed ideal. Except, that is, for the housing problem and the need for fuel.
We were talking about negotiations all the time about the building, what building. They used Hangar 1 at first. We didn't like it, but they wanted it. It wasn't adequate for them, for sure. No, like I told you before, they would not sign anything until we got a commitment that Jim Abrams got for 14 million gallons of fuel. And then we had also could not find a place for them to house their trainees that came here. Back in those days, there was no big motels, and they wanted a commitment of a motel be able to take 50 people, trainees, at any one time. Well, no of our motels. First of all, they didn't have 50 rooms. A lot of them didn't, and didn't want to make could not make a commitment to hold 50 rooms for them. And that's when I remembered that the bachelor officers' quarters that was there on Arnold had been sold to a gentleman in Seattle. And I just luckily remembered his name. And so I got a hold of him right away. And he got over here real fast, met with Japan Airlines, and they agreed. The BOQ was two units with a bath connected in between the two. One bath served 2 units, but we could handle as high as 60 officers in there. And they used that for about 10 years.
The 14 million gallons of fuel per year was a larger problem than the housing. Without that fuel, the deal with Japan Airlines would collapse.
The other problem was they laid on a need for 14 million gallons of jet fuel. Of course, during the Air Force days, all the jet fuel that we used in the B-52 and the tankers and all had come down out of Montana in the pipeline into Yellowstone pipeline.
Right.
In the meantime, when the base closed down, the market for jet fuel dried up in Moses Lake, and the fuel that was being produced by these 3 refineries in Montana then was being shipped down toward the Denver area. So Jim Abrams had to get to work to go to these three people, and he had a hell of a time getting a commitment from them. And he finally got a commitment from Continental Oil, Conoco, that yes, they could furnish 14 million gallons. And it was not until we had a signed deal showing that we had the fuel before they would sign anything with the port. And finally that was all put to bed in about September of '68. And so then we had a big grand opening in November of '68 when Jow got here. And that's a story of Jow coming here.
Jim Abrams, the port's fixed base operator, worked on getting the fuel. He negotiated with oil refineries in Montana to keep supplying that amount of jet fuel. Abrams was able to make the complicated arrangements to acquire, transport, and store the fuel Japan Airlines needed for their operations in Moses Lake. With the fuel problem and housing problem solved, the deal came together in September 1968. A dedication ceremony was held in November. It was conducted in the large hangar that Japan Airlines would use while at the port of Moses Lake, and hundreds of people attended, many wearing Japanese coats that were blue and white, with the Japanese kanji for happy on the back in red. Wearing the happy jackets were the Americans, such as the port commissioners and local dignitaries. The airline had given them all the coats that they also handed out to all first-class passengers. Japan Airlines Vice President Haruo Oragiri was one of the first people on the dais wearing a business suit. In his remarks, he concisely described why Japan Airlines loved Moses Lake. Flying in and out of Grant County Airport is like suddenly finding yourself on an interstate freeway after being snarled in a downtown traffic jam. The available training started immediately with Boeing 727s and other aircraft. When the 747 was available, Japan Airlines would have as many as 2 stationed at the Grant County Airport. Japan Airlines became the port's biggest customer. By 1970, it was generating $140,000 a year in landing fees for the port. At first, the airline made a 3 to 5 year commitment to the port of Moses Lake, but it ended up staying in the Moses Lake area for 40 years. By one estimate, in the 1990s, Japan Airlines was contributing as much as $16 million to the Moses Lake economy. While pilots stayed in the former bachelor's office quarters and stayed a short time, personnel for Japan Airlines lived in town and stayed longer, and some had colorful backgrounds.
The first captain in charge, a guy by the name of Eiji Komodo. Every airline has a pecking order, number 1 down. Okay, he was number 1 on the Japan Airline pecking list of pilots. Eiji led a whole flight of fighters attacking Pearl Harbor. He was the flight leader of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And then he ended up, when Northwest Airline formed Japan Airline in the early 50s. And he became the first pilot, and being number 1 pilot, anytime the Emperor flew any plane, Eiji did the flying. He flew the plane. No, Eiji was an officer in the Air Force, and he was one of the flight leaders on the attack of Pearl Harbor.
Japan Airlines became part of the Moses Lake community and reached out to the people of the area in many ways. A program was started early on in which every 6th grader in Moses Lake every year was taken on a flight tour of the Columbia Basin. That lasted for 30 years, and it's estimated that 21,000 children were able to fly on the planes. For many years, the winner of the Miss Moses Lake pageant was flown by Japan Airlines to Japan to participate in the annual Uesugi Festival in Yonezawa, Japan. One Miss Moses Lake, 17-year-old Marcia Anderson, rode on horseback in the Uesugi Festival parade. She later told the Spokesman Review that she had been quite the sensation, a blonde girl on horseback, surrounded by Japanese men in 16th century warrior garb. Yonezawa and Moses Lake became sister cities, and that was facilitated by executives from Japan Airlines. That relationship celebrated 35 years in August of 2016. In another program, Japan Airlines would fly 5 Moses Lake high school students in addition to adult chaperones to Japan. In total, about 190 students made the trip, and the Moses Lake community gave back to the people of Japan. Big Bend Community College started a program where Japanese farmers were brought to the Columbia Basin to learn American agricultural techniques. By 1986, more than 2,800 Japanese farmers had participated in the program. Moses Lake residents went out of their way to help the Japanese pilots and instructors feel comfortable in the desert and small-town environment. One Japan Airlines student admitted that it took him a while to adjust to the quiet life of Moses Lake and the foreign food, such as beefsteak, potatoes, and coffee. Local motels set aside rooms with Japanese amenities for the visiting pilots, and local Japanese-American residents would entertain the Japan Airlines employees in their homes. Later, in the year 2000, the city of Moses Lake would name a new street after its sister city, and thus was born Yonezawa Boulevard. The relationship between Japan Airlines and retired Colonel Clyde Owen was more than cordial.
Really working with the people and with the president, with the relationship with Japan Airlines was amazing. Up until last year or 2 years ago, I was still in correspondence with at least 5 of them. Right. Christmas time. They're all died now. They're all dead. Got very well acquainted. We had the director rotated every 2 years. So we had all wonderful guys as directors.
Not everything went perfectly for Japan Airlines and the port of Moses Lake, however, including a fatal accident.
Due to a error maybe occurring in the cockpit, on takeoff, they drugged the right wing, which forced the airplane to swing around, and it went across the field and hit over on the taxiway, and it killed 3, I guess, died, and 1 was badly burned.
The plane wasn't a 747, but a Convair 880, a medium-range narrow-body airliner that was designed to compete with Boeing's 707. The crash was on June 24, 1969. There were 5 men on board, and 3 lost their lives: Junichi Murata, Kunitsugu Kawase, and Toshiaki Hoshida. Owen and the airport fire chief were the first to arrive at the wreck, and found 2 survivors trying to pull the other men from the burning plane. While the airport part of the Port of Moses Lake was doing well, there was a need for more development of the buildings and land. The port at first was a barren place, according to Clyde Owen.
No, it was a pretty barren place as far as knowing, just as I would say, just how did you go about bringing in industry. We didn't get much help from the state, as I would say. They had 1 or 2 people that were involved in it. No, it was a matter, we had to kind of make a survey, just what exactly did we have to offer.
It was the early 1970s, and there was almost no industrial development at the Port of Moses Lake or in South Grant County. The area was still heavily dependent on agriculture and its boom and bust cycles. If farmers had a good year, the economy thrived. If the price of commodities dropped, the economy contracted. The largest employer after the Air Force left was the U&I sugar plant. At the time, no one knew that the facility would close in the late 1970s. The port needed someone who could bring in business, to use the rest of the facilities available, and generate more income. At the time, Dave Bailey, who would become the port's industrial development manager, worked for Boeing in Seattle, and Boeing was going through one of its periods of layoffs.
Starting in about, in the early 70s, after the Boeing 747 was flight tested and certified, a lot of people were laid off. And you remember the sign, "The last person in Seattle, please turn off the lights." Well, I knew that I was going to be a victim of layoff at some point in time. But I was still working in flight test, and I was working on several other NASA programs and things of that nature. But I knew that there was going to be some layoff potential because I was the youngest engineer in my group. So I decided I'd better start taking a look at what other opportunities are going to be available. Because I had a young family. I had a young son that was 1 year old and a daughter that was 3. So we knew that if I was ever laid off, it was going to be very difficult to find another position within the Seattle area.
The needs of the port and the needs of Dave Bailey coincided.
Back in those days, there wasn't anyone else in Moses Lake that was associated with doing the so-called industrial development work. In fact, there was no organization of any sort in Grant County as we now know the economic development. The only ones that did anything in industrial development was a doctor with PUD, Strom.
Dr. Strauss, right?
Dr. Strom was connected with PUD, and it was kind of his job to try to bring industry into Moses Lake. And you got to remember at that time, now we're talking about, nothing much had happened here. It was a rather quiet period of time as far as industry and all moving in here.
Bailey wrote a letter to Owen asking about the job, and then he got a letter back asking him to come for an interview.
Clyde wrote me a letter saying that they would like to take an interview for this particular position, and so I drove over the night before, stayed in Moses Lake that evening, and took an interview with Clyde out at the terminal building. And this was kind of a new approach to interviews, because not only did I have an interview with Clyde, but I also interviewed with the three commissioners. That was Dan Dunn, Dr. Leon Bodie, and Floyd Riggs. No, it was Dean Haggerty was commissioner then.
Bailey wasn't sure he was right for the job of industrial development manager.
And so we went through a very extensive interview about economic and industrial development, which was not an area that I was very familiar with. I mean, I was in flight test and manufacturing, and they wanted somebody that really had some experience in marketing and development and things of this nature.
Despite his doubts, Bailey got the job with the Port of Moses Lake.
So after we completed the interview and I went back to work at the Boeing company, and then I received a phone call from Harold Swear. He was the housing manager at that point in time, and said that it looks like you may be coming to work for the port, and if I was interested in a house. Well, then Clyde gave me a call and said that they were going to offer this position to me at the Port District.
Owen's first order to Bailey was to learn about his new job.
And so I think the first instructions I told Dave, I said, you're going to be the industrial development manager, find out everything you know, because I don't know much about it myself. And Dave kind of got the job as that, plus helping me be running the port. I mean, it was.
With Dave Bailey on board, the Port of Moses Lake looked to the future with optimism. The port came to exist on the heels of possible economic disaster. The vision of the people of Moses Lake, under the leadership of Commissioners Leon Bodie, Floyd Rigsby, and Dan Dunn, was turning what could have been a weed-infested white elephant into an economic boon to the city and Grant County. After the exhilaration of that October 1966 dedication ceremony, the hard work began. The Port of Moses Lake had had its first successes, partially through luck, but mostly through hard work and perseverance. After a relationship with Moses Lake that lasted 40 years, Japan Airlines left in 2009. Boeing still flight tests and trains pilots at the port, but not at the rate of the 1960s and 70s. Economic development became more and more important to the port, and Dave Bailey was the man leading that charge. There were more challenges to come and more work to do, and Mother Nature would provide the port with one of its biggest challenges.